Well, I want to go ahead and get started on my end and welcome all of you. I know we've got quite the staggering number of registrations, so I hope that is borne out in our attendees. And I want to welcome everybody to another edition of Reader Meet Writer, sponsored by SIBA. I'm your host, Wiley Cash. I myself am a novelist. I have a new novel, When Ghosts Come Home, coming out September 21st. You can find it at any SIBA retail bookseller. We are coming to you live tonight from Flyleaf Books in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I want to give a big thank you for hosting us here tonight, for hosting me. I've been doing a lot of traveling and I found myself with no home. And like so many of us, independent bookstores have always been home to me. And so they made a home for me tonight in their event space to host the one and only Lisa Jewell. I want to talk a little bit about SIBA. SIBA stands for the Southern Independent Bookseller Alliance. SIBA represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. And perhaps you're here tonight because one of those bookstores shared this with you on their email newsletter, or you saw it on their Facebook page or Instagram or wherever. If that's the case and you are interested in purchasing Lisa Jewell's new novel, The Night She Disappeared, please do that from the bookseller that brought you here tonight. Independent bookstores are the lifeblood of our literary culture, and they need us now more than ever. And I would argue that we need them now more than ever. Tonight, we're thrilled to have Lisa Jewell with her brand new novel. We're going to be taking questions at the very end. So while Lisa and I are talking about her book, if something sticks out in your mind and you want to ask a question, go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your question in there. And make sure you mention your name and the name of your home independent bookstore. And I'll ask Lisa your question at the end of our show tonight. So don't wait. Type in your question, even if we're not even talking yet and I'm blabbing on and you've got a question about the book, make sure you type it in. I want to just give you a heads up for several upcoming events that we've got. Saturday, September 11th at 11 a.m., we'll be hosting author Torben Cullum and his in conversation with Constance Lombardo. And they'll be discussing Coleman's new book, Einstein, The Fantastic Journey of a Mouse Through Space and Time. Thursday, next week, a week from tonight at 7 p.m., I'll be in conversation with beloved New York Times columnist Margaret Rankle to discuss her new book, Graceland at Last, Notes on Hope and Heartache from the American South. And then 2 weeks from tonight, Thursday, September 23rd, I'll be talking about my new novel, When Ghosts Come Home, with the audiobook narrator, J.D. Jackson. He and I will talk about that book. That event is sponsored by SIBA in partnership with Libro FM. So we've got 3 events to finish out this part of our season, and I hope you join us for all of them. But as I mentioned tonight, we're really excited to be back with you with a mega literary star, Lisa Jewell, who is so kind to stay up past her bedtime and join us live from London. Lisa Jewell is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 19 novels, including The Family Upstairs and When She Was Gone, as well as Invisible Girl and Watching You. Her novels have sold over 5 million copies internationally, and her work has also been translated into 28 languages. Her new novel is The Night She Disappeared. Lisa, welcome to Reader Meet Writer. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here. It really is.
Well, can you start us off by just kind of telling us a little bit about your new novel?
Okay, so The Night She Disappeared begins with teenage parents, Zach and Tallulah, who have a 1-year-old son, going on a date to the pub in the village where they live. They leave their baby Noah at home with Tallulah's mother, Kim. And in the pub, they meet some of the posh kids from the boarding school, which is also in the village where they live, and end up being invited to a raucous pool party in this incredible mansion way out in the countryside outside the village. And Tallulah texts her mum and says, "We've been invited to a pool party. Is it okay if we stay out a bit later?" And Kim says, "Sure, stay out as long as you like." And Kim wakes up the next morning and Zach and Tallulah have not come home. The story picks up a year later. Zach and Tallulah are still missing, and a new head teacher comes to work at the boarding school in the village. And his girlfriend, who moves down with him is a detective novelist. And on her first day exploring the grounds of this boarding school, she finds nailed to a fence at the back of the head teacher's cottage a sign saying "dig here," with the words "dig here" scrawled on it, and an arrow pointing down into the soil. And she digs, and thus the cold case comes back to the surface of the missing teenagers.
That's an incredible synopsis and an incredible way to kind of jump off into the discussion of this. And the first real question that I've got for you is, you have all of these rich characters, you have these wonderful characterizations, you have this really grabby plot. I mean, that pitch right there, anyone listening is like, oh my God, I want to find out, these missing kids, this clue. But the question that I have for you to begin with is, you have the most wonderful elements of setting and set pieces in this novel. Woods, boarding school, parties at big estates. How did you go about building the atmosphere in this book? And were you doing a lot of research into different aspects of these various cultures?
So this came to me. The idea for this book came to me in quite a prosaic kind of a non-magical way, in that I was chatting to someone and they said the words boarding school, and I suddenly thought I'd really like to write a novel set inside a boarding school. I've not done that before. And at that thought, I remembered 6 years ago driving from London out to the countryside with my husband to collect our puppy from the dog breeder out in the countryside. And we drove through a few stunning Surrey villages. And there was this one village we drove through that had a boarding school facing out onto the village green. And I remember thinking, wow, must be quite an amazing experience to be at school in a village this beautiful. So when it came to me visualizing this boarding school that I wanted to write, this place just suddenly popped back into my memory from 6 years beyond. So it was kind of already there. It was only a fleeting glimpse of this village. We drove through it quite quickly, but it was all there. So I could already sense it and feel it and picture it and imagine the sorts of people who live behind the doors of these grand houses and the small cottages. So it was quite easy from that point just to extrapolate those sort of like the facade and go backwards and think, well, what's behind that boarding school? What do the grounds of the boarding school look like? And then maybe there's some woods behind that boarding school. And if you were to walk into the woods, where would you end up? If you kept walking, where would the path take you? And then thinking, oh, maybe it would take you to the back of this incredible country estate owned by a very wealthy man. So that, yeah, it just sort of came from this flashcard image in my mind and just grew across the pages.
I think boarding schools, are such wonderful places to set fiction because it introduces all of these different personalities. And of course, we have, especially here in the States, we have a tradition of writing, kind of domestic novels that are set in boarding schools. I'm thinking of A Separate Peace. I'm thinking of, in a roundabout way, Cider House Rules, The Art of Fielding that came out a couple of years ago. What were some particularly opportunities that came about in writing about a boarding school or including a boarding school? Like what issues of like class and gender were kind of bubbling up with these characters?
Well, for me, it was the location of this boarding school, which it was in a village, and most English villages are little microcosms. So quite often you'll get the sort of grand houses, and then as a village peters away, you'll get the smaller houses, because back in the day you needed the people in the small houses to tend to the people who lived in the big houses. So you're always going to get different class structures going on within these tiny little pockets of life. So yeah, and then obviously a boarding school, particularly this is a rather exclusive, very expensive boarding school, offers even more opportunities to explore those contrasts. So there's some sort of mention in the book of the way that the kids at the boarding school behave around the kids who were born and brought up in this village, and how they're perceived by the kids. So the kids who are manning the tills in the local co-op, who went to school in the village, and how they perceive these kids who turn up in their sort of convertible mini clubman cars and just sort of screech around town and complain about the fact there's no avocado and this sort of thing. So it was, yeah, it just offered all sorts of opportunities to have fun with that sort of class differential that exists in all British villages.
And sometimes we have quite a few writers tune into these things. And can I ask you a writerly question, like a craft question? You know, do you feel like creating something like a boarding school in that dichotomy between classes? Did you feel like that was some great tension that you were kind of relying on? Maybe not narrative tension in terms of how propulsive this novel is, but tension between the characters that just kept you coming back to the page to kind of get in there and kind of figure out who these people are.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole idea that I had was that there was going to be the significance of this sign nailed to the fence, dig here, and the clue that was going to come up was going to lead to the revelation that a child who'd been born and brought up in this village, a child from a working class background, was going to have come a cropper, having connected somehow in some way, which I hadn't quite established before I started writing the book, with someone at the boarding school. And so that was the absolute sort of that was the energy that I was looking for, was this sort of clash between what would happen if this kid and then it's sort of making her a teenage mother made it even more, added even more piquancy to that, because the sorts of kids who go to the boarding school don't have babies when they're teenagers. They've got more important things to do with their lives. So yeah, making her a teenage mother fed into that as well, that contrast between them. So that was always going to be the main thrust of the novel, was what would happen if a kid from one of the little houses came upon one of the kids from the boarding school, and darkness may ensue. I wasn't sure what form the darkness would take, but yeah, that was the energy I was looking for.
Well, I want to talk about your not knowing. You said you didn't know when you first began, you know, exactly where things were going, but you knew you were looking for this darkness to write from it. And I love the word you used, energy. That's such a great. I always think about tension. I think about plot. I think about causality, but I think energy is such a great word to talk about in terms of propelling a narrative and animating characters, you know, compulsions or the things that they're doing. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the major players, the characters in the novel?
Okay, so we have got Kim Knox, who is a slightly she's 39 and she's become a grandmother, and she's slightly shell-shocked by this, having been a teenage mother herself. She's quite shocked to find herself taking care of a baby again so soon after she feels she's kind of done that with her own children. And she lives in one of the small houses in the village with Tallulah and Tallulah's brother Ryan, and no other baby. And Tallulah is a very responsible child. She's a very quiet child. She doesn't want to be noticed. She doesn't want to be looked at. She plays down her qualities quite a lot, and she just wants to get up every morning, go to college, study, become a better person, take care of her baby. Yes, she's a very, very sensible girl. Then you've got over at the boarding school, you have Sean, who is the new head teacher, and he's in his early 40s, and he's got his girlfriend Sophie Beck, who is 10 years younger than him, and they've only been in a relationship for 6 months, which is quite interesting. They met at the beginning of the summer, and she knew that he had this job to go to in the countryside. They were in London, and it was that awful realization as the summer rolled on that he was going to go, and she would have to make that decision about whether to let him go or not. And she decides to jump. She decides to jump ship from London to the countryside, take her laptop, and she feels very much that she will continue to write novels as the head teacher's wife in the countryside, in this huge lifestyle change. And then you also have Scarlett. Scarlett is where a lot of this energy comes from that we were just talking about. And Scarlett is the same age as Tallulah, but has a very, very different background to Tallulah, and she lives in this massive sort of fairy tale mansion in the countryside behind the woods. And she's a kind of poor little rich girl. She really is a poor little rich girl. She very rarely sees her parents, and she just sort of rattles around this huge house with her St. Bernard dog, who's her only true friend. But she's kind of magnetic, and she somehow draws Tallulah towards her, and that's where it all sort of stems from. All the darkness stems from basically when Tallulah and Scarlett cross paths.
Well, speaking of darkness, you've often written about family and relationship dynamics in your other books, and this novel, your new novel, The Night She Disappeared, it's got a type of romantic tension and toxicity that readers may not have seen from you before. So can you talk about how you got in the headspace to write about this kind of coercive control that people may have over others in these toxic relationships?
Yeah, no, I can easily talk about that. But it's interesting that it wasn't. Initially, Tallulah was going to be a single mother, a single teenage mother with a deadbeat dad somewhere in the background who didn't want to be involved in his son's life. But he just sort of interjected himself quite early on into the story, and he wouldn't leave Tallulah alone. And I kind of felt like he was doing this. He wanted to be part of Tallulah's life and part of the story. So I kind of let him back into Tallulah's family bubble. And once he was there, once I decided that she wasn't going to be a single mother, that she was going to be raising her son with the son's father, I thought he needs to do something. He needs to create some sort of tension, he needs to add something and not just be hanging around. And I've had the experience of a coercive, controlling relationship. I was married in my early 20s to a guy who controlled me for 5 years. So I know of which I write. When it is one of those things, I like to make things up most of the time, but occasionally I can dig into my own experience and write about that. And that's certainly the case with the dynamic between Zach and Tallulah, which just it came as a necessity to the narrative that there should be something going on between Zach and Tallulah that the reader would be invested in and discomforted by and worried about. So that's how I took their relationship. But it was interesting to me because I didn't have any clue as these sort of uncomfortable moments build up how far it was going to go. Because those sorts of relationships can sometimes reach quite violent and terrifying depths. So yeah, I just let it play out on the page and see where it went.
And you've created characters over the course of writing a book that feel real to you, and you want them to feel real to the character. I mean, real to the reader.
Yeah.
So when a character is showing you who they are,
yeah,
you kind of just let go of whatever preconceived ideas you have and kind of follow
exactly
the lead, right?
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened there. I just thought, okay, it's going to be like that, is it? Well, then let's just go with it.
That's fascinating. So can you talk about writing about a writer?
Well, yes. So this was another interesting thing in the life of a novelist who doesn't plot her books, is that I always like to have a male perspective in my books. And this is one of the rare books of mine that doesn't have a male perspective. And that's because initially it was going to be Sean, the head teacher, who was going to be the one to uncover the clue and the one to follow the mystery. And I wrote the first chapter from his point of view, and I just thought, I'm not sure I'm terribly interested in you as a person. But I looked, sort of with my writer's eye at the scene I'd just written, and I thought, your girlfriend looks quite interesting. Maybe it would be more fun if we saw this from her point of view, if she was the one to find the dig here sign. And then I had to stop for a minute and think, well, who is she then, and what's her job? And I kind of toyed for a short while with it had to be a job that she could leave in London in its entirety and uproot and bring to a cottage in the middle of the countryside and still be able to carry on doing it. And I ridiculously, it took me a while to come up with the idea of, oh, she could be a novelist. And then once I decided she could be a novelist, I thought, well, maybe she could be a detective novelist. That might be fun. That might be fun. But I decided I wouldn't make her a psychological thriller writer, because that would just be too close for comfort. So she writes cozy crime, and she writes a series called The Little Hithergreen Detective Agency, about the pair of private eyes in a South London suburb, cracking local crimes. So yeah, it was fun. It was fun doing that with her.
So you said you don't want to make it too close to home and have her write, psychological suspense, and I want to talk about, and if you can talk about, I'll ask about the trajectory of your career. You've done a lot of things over the course of many books. You've moved from contemporary fiction to kind of what now is a kind of a suspense novel, a psychological suspense novel. How do you track that evolution or that transition? And what has the reception been from readers? And is there something in this book, this new novel, The Night She Disappeared, that readers may not have seen from you before?
Yeah, so to answer the first part of your question, yeah, I can very much see how it all evolved, looking back on it from this vantage point. So I started writing my first novel in 1996, and it was published in 1999. And despite the sense I'd always had that I would write a novel, I would someday write a novel, and I would be probably quite old, and it would be very dark. I actually ended up writing a novel when I was really quite young, and it was a very light novel, and it was a romantic comedy, because that was just what I had in me at that time. As much as my tastes in literature were quite dark, when it came to me creating something, I came up with something much lighter than I might have anticipated, and that did really well in the UK, and that informed, obviously, the choices that I made for the next few books, because if you've sold a lot of copies, then your publishers are hoping that you'll kind of repeat the trick. And so my first few novels were funny and romantic, and they were quirky, and they were rough around the edges as well. They weren't sort of hearts and flowers romances. There was a lot of swearing and drugs and what have you going on in these books. And then I got older, I had kids, my book sales slowed down, so I had some breathing space. I didn't feel so much like I was in the spotlight of my publisher's attention, and that they weren't expecting anything in particular from me. And I felt that there was a lot of trust in me, and it was just like, oh yeah, Lisa Jewell, she writes good books. So I kind of started to kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit, and trying to leave the romance behind and sort of push into slightly darker areas, and talking about the reader response. That was always part of the evolution, was me sensing if I'd ever pushed it too far, or if I was alienating readers. So obviously the ultimate goal would be to retain the readers who like the romantic comedies, but also pick up some new readers along the way who didn't like the romantic comedies, but were more interested in what I was writing about, dark family secrets. And as I've moved into psychological thrillers as well, into even more darker areas. So it happened so slowly that maybe people didn't even notice. And the response has been, yeah, really, really, really positive, in terms of not having lost any readers and having picked up lots of readers. And what's amazing, particularly amazing for a writer who's been around for so long and written so many books that I felt maybe were slightly overlooked at the time, is new readers going through my backlist, which is such an incredibly exciting thing when I keep getting messages from people who are exploring my older books and finding new life in them. So yeah, the whole journey has been very organic, very led by my own instincts, and very positive.
That's wonderful. And I want to go back to the word you just said, organic, but I want to remind our viewers that if you have a question for Lisa, go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type in your name, the name of your home independent bookstore, and I will ask Lisa your question after I ask just one or two more. You mentioned organic just a moment ago, Lisa. Can you talk about your writing process? Because several times over the course of our conversation, you've mentioned with the character, you didn't know what he was going to become, or you didn't know what he was going to do, or how he was going to reveal himself, or you didn't know where the darkness would come from. But once you found it, you wrote from that space. Can you talk about your writing process, either on a day-to-day basis or just the generative, what you're trying to inhabit at the desk when you sit down?
Yeah, so I sit down in the afternoon. I'm an afternoon writer because I like to clear my decks. I don't want anything hanging over my head or little jobs that I think I should do, because I'll just let them distract me. So unlike most writers, I write after lunch. I think most writers like to get it out of the way in the morning. And then I come to my document, my work in progress, and I will read what I wrote the day before, just to sort of get me up to speed. And I might make some tiny adjustments to that. And then I start writing quite slowly. And it's sort of quite painful for a while. And I kind of every single day, I think I've forgotten how to write. For the first hour or so, I think I've sat here for an hour and I've written 12 words. I've forgotten how to write, but then it just sort of picks up speed. And I usually spend about 3 hours a day at my laptop writing, and in that 3 hours I like to write 1,000 words. And in terms of how I manage the plot, I just let the plot manage me in a way, in that I just to me it's all it is to me is getting as many words on the screen as I can, because I know that when I'm writing those words, most of the time I'm not going to feel that what I've written is important, good, interesting, moving the plot along, working hard. It's always just going to feel like I've written some words. And so it's not until the words are written that I can look back and see, actually, okay, yeah, I can see what I've done now. I can see what I did yesterday. And what I've actually done is I've got myself to this point where now I need to think about X, Y, and Z happening. So I sort of just set myself up every day for the next day, and I write day by day, word by word. Yeah, it's just a sort of gradual process of putting words on the screen, really.
I love that. People always say, what's the hardest thing about publishing a book? And I always say, writing a book. That's the hardest
Yes, writing a book. It is,
thing.
it is. And it never feels like you're doing it well.
No.
You get the occasional moment where you think, oh, that was quite clever, or wow, where did that come from? But sort of 90% of the time, it doesn't feel like you're doing it well. You don't know when you're writing a good book. It doesn't feel like you're writing a good book when you're writing it. That all happens afterwards. And that's the sort of the faith that you have to keep, is it doesn't, just because it doesn't feel like it's a good book that you're writing, it doesn't mean that it won't be a good book.
Yeah. The feeling of it is there, and you keep going back to that feeling every day when you sit down, even if you don't see the whole thing, see the expanse of it.
Exactly.
You're doing it. We've got some questions lining up. If you'll indulge us with some questions, we have a question from Georgina. Georgina is joining us from Alabama. There are so many great independent bookstores in Alabama. But she asked, my question for you, Lisa, is when you finish the first draft of a book, what are some things that you do? Do you slam the laptop shut, walk, eat a bunch of candy, take a nap, or do you have a beer or buy yourself a treat? How many days break do you take before looking at the manuscript again?
Okay, so first draft for me is I deliver my first draft directly to my editor, which is quite unusual. Very few writers do that, and I do that at the end of every year. And it's so it's usually some point in the build up before Christmas time. And what do I do? It totally depends on when I type the end. So that I type the end, I take a photograph of my screen with the words "the end." I put it on social media and I let everybody congratulate me. It's my little party, and everybody's really excited that I finished the book, and then I can feel really. So when I finished writing The Family Upstairs, it happened to be a Friday night, and Friday night is my vodka tonic night. So I wrote the end. I took a photograph, put it on social media, let everybody congratulate me. Had a large vodka and tonic. But sometimes I'll finish writing a book in a coffee shop in the middle of the day. So then I just have to just kind of get on with my life without any form of celebration. And 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 then I read it through probably the next day. I will set aside a day and read it from beginning to end. And then I'll just send it to my editor and let her worry about it for a while and just not think about it until I hear back from her.
That's great. I love that idea of putting it on social media and letting people congratulate you.
Yeah, well, it's a huge thing. And if my family don't care. It's just like I could stand
it's
up.
just mom writing more books.
I know. I could stand up in the middle of the living room and sort of do a happy dance, and they would just look at me as if I was mad. Whereas if I put it on social media, everybody gets it, and I get my sort of celebratory feeling that way.
That's great. I understand it. So Shelley wants to know, what was your path to publication or getting an agent, and did you have some ups and downs during your journey to publication?
I was really lucky, and timing is everything. And I wrote my first novel, Rouse Party, and I got an agent in 1997, I think, or early 1998, which was precisely the moment that the big Bridget Jones thing happened, and precisely the moment that every single publisher in London was falling over themselves to get hold of books written by young women living in London about their relationships, and flat sharing and jobs and difficult relationships with their mothers and gay best friends and all of those things that were just so popular in the late 90s. And I just came along and hit the zeitgeist at the right moment. So I don't know what it would have been like for me if I had tried writing the wrong book at the wrong time, or the right book at the wrong time, but I happened to write the right book at the right time. And so that's the perfect storm. So I'd love to say I struggled to get a publishing deal, but I didn't. I found an agent, and she read the book and said, I'm going to get you a publishing deal. And she did. And that was a 2-book deal with Penguin, back in 1998, and it was published in 1999. So I wish I could share terrible tales of rejection and sitting on slush piles for years and having loads of unpublished manuscripts under my bed, but I don't. I got very, very lucky with my first try.
We just lost half the audience. Half the audience just
clicked. I'm so sorry.
No,
I'm so sorry.
Well, did you know you always wanted to be a writer? Was that always in the back of your mind?
I always, it was the only thing I was any good at. I was really good at writing at school, and I wasn't good at anything else. And I used to be a big reader as a child. I stopped reading when I was a teenager and didn't pick it up again until in my 20s. It just was the thing in the back of my head that I was a secretary at the time that I was writing my first novel. I was actually a PA to a marketing director at a shirt makers in Mayfair. And I just thought that writing books is what women did when they were sort of post-child rearing. I thought I needed to wait. I thought I needed to have a few grey hairs and a few life experiences and have reached that point in my life where the next phase. So yeah, I did always think I'd write a book, but I certainly didn't imagine that I would have a career that spanned my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, and now into my 50s, which is when I thought I would write my first novel. Yeah.
Somebody, Shelley asked another question. Do you have any craft books that you've leaned on? And I'll also ask, what were you reading? Do you remember anything that you were reading while you were working on The Night She Disappeared that came to bear on the book itself? So craft books and influences while writing.
I've never read any how to write a novel books. I've bought some. I've got them on my bookshelves, but I've never actually read them. I really don't like people telling me how to do things, which is why my husband and I come to blows quite frequently, because he likes telling people how to do things. I don't like being told how to do things. I like to work out how to do things by myself. So yeah, that's why those books have sat unread on my bookshelves, because I'd rather make my own mistakes and learn my own lessons and not have somebody tell me how to do it. And what was I reading while I was writing this? I don't know. I wrote this during lockdown, so I wrote this throughout 2020, which was such a weird year. Oh, and now we've now lived through another weird year. and I just lost my reading mojo. I found it really hard to read. I just became sort of a bit of a smartphone addict because I just wanted to stay connected to the world all the time, and rather than escape it. So I can't really remember what I was reading when I wrote it at all.
Well, how did the pandemic itself come to bear on this novel? Like kind of the claustrophobic feeling of some of the scenes. How did the pandemic affect your worldview when you were writing this book?
Not entirely, because I'd already set it up. I started writing it in February 2020, so I'd kind of set up the whole, the dark place, the big mansion. I'd set up the boarding school. I'd set up Tallulah's relationship and her mother. So it was all there, ready to go. And then I just had to sort of write it through the lockdown, which actually stopped me writing for about 4 weeks, because I could not get my head back into the space of people who lived in a world that hadn't experienced the pandemic. I couldn't relate to them. I was just like, hold on, you just went to the pub. I don't understand. You've got no idea what's around the corner. You're just completely naive, thinking that you can just go around hugging people and you'll send your kids off to school and what have you. So for a while I felt quite alienated from the book, and I had to really force myself to go back to it and kind of get over myself a little bit. So I'm not sure how much that sort of locked down mentality kind of fed its way into the book itself, given that I'd already set the whole thing up. But maybe it did. I hadn't thought of the tunnel, in fact, before lockdown, and I did think of the tunnel after lockdown. So I have to read it to find out about the tunnel.
Yeah. So we have one more question. DJ from Memphis, Tennessee, Novel Bookstore. DJ asks, she loves the idea of you reading what you wrote the day before. And she asks, how much do you change at that point? Or do you change anything? Or do you just push on?
I tweak. All right. Well, here's the thing that I do as well. I can't type. I absolutely cannot type. So what appears on the screen when I'm typing is kind of gobbledygook. And I leave it like that, because then I'm forced to go back through it to correct my typos. And in correcting my typos, it gives me the opportunity to sort of rethink tiny things, just finesse things in a way. So I deliberately leave all my typos to come back to the next day, which is quite weird. It's actually quite a weird thing when I think about it. Because so if I'm going to correct the spelling of a word, then maybe I could change the word for a better word as well. So I don't change like fundamental or structural things when I do that little read through, but I do just sort of tweak and polish and play with it a bit.
Do you have an idea what's next, or are you still living in the world of the night?
No, well, I am living in the world in terms of that's the book that I'm talking about a lot to people, quite a lot of the time, but I'm also supposedly I need to get back to it. I need to get into a routine. This is another thing that writers need, and I'm sure you'll agree, Wiley. You need Groundhog Day, you need routine, you need every day to be really, really a similar shape. I know some people can write wherever they lay their hat. They can pull their laptop out and tap something out, but I can't. I need routine, and I haven't quite got back into the routine. But so once I find myself back in routine, I will be rejoining the book that I started writing in March, which is now halfway through. It's at 45,000 words. And it's a sequel, in fact, to The Family Upstairs, which was my 17th novel. So hopefully I'll be getting back into that.
That's very exciting. That's very exciting news. And Lisa, thank you so much for joining us tonight and being so gracious with your time.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation. And thank you, booksellers.
Absolutely. Good night, everybody. Join us
Good night, everybody.
On Saturday and then Thursday of next week. Good night, everybody.
Bye.